It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area.
Hello, good evening. If everyone would take a look at the back of this small sheet right here, if you're interested in very detailed information about our speaker, it's back here. But just to say that Dr. Vella is been a champion of St. Bernard Parish for a long time. I was just speaking with her, and she taught at St. Bernard Community College for years. She has been involved in the parish through writing for the St. Bernard Voice, and is really very enthusiastic about coming here. I emailed her and she immediately said yes. She's always supported activities at this college and in this parish. But I think you would agree that she has a pretty impressive resume. She's the author of several books. She's been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize twice. For any of you who read that she was nominated for the Nobel Prize, that was my mistake, but she has said that she will accept that as a compliment. And But she will be available to offer up some of her books in the back. A few of them are listed here. She's been nominated for several awards. She travels throughout the country and I'm sure the world talking and speaking about her work. She writes primarily now, and she's been featured in all kinds of different magazines. She's been on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. So it's pretty amazing to have someone, a speaker that travels around the country and around the world, but is so enthusiastic about coming back to Nunez. And so put your hands together, please, for Dr. Christina Vella.
Gosh, who wouldn't want to come back to some place where you're treated like a queen? Oh, my goodness, it's so good to see you all. There is no place I can think of, no podium that is dearer to me than this one. St. Bernard Community College was a place where I spent my happiest years, and now that it's Nunez Community College, I just am cheering for it all the way. Every one of you have been through so much. This college has been through so much, and to see you all here and to see a lecture series going on is just wonderful. I'm going to ask you to sign my book. I do this every place I speak. I do not sell the names and addresses to Victoria's Secret. I use them so that when I publish a book, I can communicate with the people who've come to the lectures and just let them know that I have another book out. Publishers love it when you give them a list of addresses they can contact, but that's the only time that I'll use it. So if I can just start passing this out, and if you get a chance, please. Let's see, it had a pen with it. You have one? Before I start, I want to thank especially Dr. Tommy Warner, Ron Chapman, Curtis Manning, Nick Sly for inviting me. It's just always flattering to be invited. They asked me to talk about Louisiana writers, and that's a lot of fun. I'm so glad that they thought of that topic. I started making a list of all the Louisiana writers I could think of who, for one reason or another, deserved recognition. And this was the list. Probably you could add a lot to it. This is just off the top of my head. Grace King, Walker Percy, Ernest Gaines, Lyle Saxon, Lafcadio O'Hearn, Kate Chopin, George Cable, Anne Rice, Mark Twain, John Kennedy Toole, Shirley Jackson, Tennessee Williams, Francis Parkinson Kyes, Truman Capote, Dorothy Dixon, Harnett Kane. Well, obviously I can't talk about all of those. Some of them are people that I've read and loved, and I hope you have too. Some I've never read, but I hope you have. Some I don't like at all, but I hope you do. So let me just talk about a couple who are near and dear to my heart. Two whose names you will know immediately. Excuse me. and one whom you probably never heard of, but she was maybe the most famous of all of those that I've mentioned. Let's start with Truman Capote. Boy, if anybody ever started out with 3 strikes against him, it was Capote. His name was Truman Streckfus Persons, and he was born in 1924 in New Orleans. He died, by the way, in 1984. And since he was born in New Orleans and since he did some of his major work here, I think we have as much right to claim him as anybody. Now, all of these, let me see if I can do this without killing your ears. Oh, thank you, honey. We've heard so much about Truman Capote lately on account of the movies that are basically about in cold blood. But I wanted to do him again because those movies really don't tell you, or they were good movies, but they didn't really tell you much about Truman Capote, the great writer. In Cold Blood was a terrific book. It was an interesting book, a page-turner, but it wasn't the great writer that Truman Capote was. He started out in New Orleans. His father was a traveling salesman, a steamboat clerk. He never kept his job. His mother was a 16-year-old beauty queen who was named Lily Mae Falk. His parents divorced when he was 4, and his mother abandoned him. She sent him to live with some elderly, rather severe Protestant aunts in Alabama. And one of those aunts, who was not severe, became the model for A Christmas Memory, which he wrote when he was 42. He and this aunt were separated when he was 7. And although this takes us out of the chronology, it certainly wasn't one of his first works. I want to read you a little bit of A Christmas Memory. I think this may be the greatest American short story, or novella, depending on what you want to call it. And this is how it begins. Imagine a morning in late November, a coming of a winter morning, more than 20 years ago. Consider the kitchen of a spreading old house in a country town. A great black stove is its main feature, but there's also a big round table and a fireplace with 2 rocking chairs placed in front of it. Just today, the fireplace commenced its seasonal roar. By the way, this is the whole story right here, and it's, big wide print. It's not a thick thing to read. A woman with shorn white hair is standing at the kitchen window. She's wearing tennis shoes and a shapeless gray sweater over a summery calico dress. She's small and sprightly like a bantam hen, but due to a long youthful illness, her shoulders are pitifully hunched. Her face is remarkable, not unlike Lincoln's, craggy like that, and tinted by sun and wind, but it's delicate too, finely boned, and her eyes are sherry-colored and timid. Oh my, she explains, her breath smoking the windpane. It's fruitcake weather. And then he describes how he, 7 years old, and his aunt, here he does it. The person to whom she is speaking is myself. I am 7. She is 60-something. We are cousins, very distant ones, and we have lived together, well, as long as I can remember. Other people inhabit the house, relatives, and though they have power over us and frequently make us cry, we are not, on the whole, much aware of them. We are each other's best friend. She calls me Buddy in memory of a boy who was formerly her best friend. The other Buddy died in the 1880s when she was still a child. She is still a child. And then he goes on to describe how they save their pennies. They enter all kinds of contests for naming racehorses and doing all sorts of stuff that they don't know anything about because they need money to make Christmas fruitcakes. They came in 79th in one of those contests, and so they got together the money for this year. And they make these fruitcakes that they give to people like the train conductor who passes through town and waves at them. Perfect strangers. They send one to the White House, and they always get a nice letter back, a thank you note from Mrs. Roosevelt. And the whole thing just describes how they go on with his little buggy carriage, a baby carriage that serves as the cart, the wagon, and they go collecting all of the ingredients for the fruit cakes. And it gets more and more poignant as you realize the ordinary pain of these people's lives. What Truman Capote was about wasn't something extraordinary like a murder in Kansas. He was about the ordinary pain of ordinary people that is so incomprehensible, and the saintliness of ordinary people and the specialness of ordinary people. He says, he describes her. Let me see if I can find the place. I had this so marked, but the light's kind of strange here. Bear with me for just a minute, because he describes this old lady whom he loves so much in terms of what she's never done, which is really kind of nice. He's talking about the purse that they save their pennies in. The purse is seldom removed from the safe location except to make a deposit, or as happens every Saturday, a withdrawal. For on Saturdays I'm allowed 10 cents to go to the picture show. My friend has never been to a picture show, nor does she intend to. I'd rather hear you tell the story, buddy. That way I can imagine it more. Besides, a person my age shouldn't squander their eyes. When the Lord comes, let me see him clear. In addition to never having seen a movie, she has never eaten in a restaurant, traveled more than 5 miles from home, received or sent a telegram, read anything except funny papers in the Bible, worn cosmetics, cursed, wished someone harm, told a lie on purpose, let a hungry dog go hungry. That's quite a portrait. I won't read any more of A Christmas Memory to you, because invariably, as it goes on, it's not a morbid story at all, but I always start blubbering when I read it. If I read it 50 times, I cry 50 times, so I'm not going to subject you to that. He was separated from this woman when he was 7 years old, and he lived a very solitary, lonely existence. He wrote every day. He had a friendship with Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, and she modeled Dill in the story of To Kill a Mockingbird on Truman Capote. And this is what she wrote about Dill. This is Harper Lee. Dill was a curiosity. He wore his blue linen shorts buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. I love that word. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. His laugh was sudden and happy. Well, his mother remarried. She married a Cuban textile manufacturer, and Truman Capote was sent to New York, and they put him in boarding schools, which you can imagine he just despised. He's frail. When he was full grown, he was only 5'2". He was peculiar looking all his life. He was weird looking. And one of the things that I don't think the movies about Capote, at times in those movies, the actors almost looked handsome. Truman Capote was never anything but grotesque looking. Those of you who remember seeing him on television, he was arresting. I mean, you couldn't take your eyes off of him. At times, he almost looked like a circus freak. He was just a strange looking person. He went to these boarding schools, and then at the age of 17, he decided that he was not going to subject himself to the ridicule anymore. He dropped out of school at 17 and left home and went to the New Yorker, where his job was sorting cartoons for the New Yorker. And he had always been writing. It was the antidote to his loneliness. And he wrote a story that attracted the attention of Bennett Cerf, who gave him a contract to write a novel called Other Voices, Other Rooms, which came out in 1945 and was absolutely autobiographical. The story of Other Voices, Other Rooms focuses on a 13-year-old boy, Joel Knox. He is living with his mother in New Orleans when she dies, and he's sent to live with his father, who had abandoned him when he was a baby. He goes to Alabama to this crumbling old mansion, and there he meets his stepmother, who is sometimes very twittering and Southern bellish and at other times downright sullen. His stepmother has a companion whose name is Randolph. Randolph is a transvestite. This is in 1945, mind you. And there are other people on the property. There is a lovely, loving Negro woman named Zoo, and another very lovable Negro named Jesus Fever. And there's a very defiant little tomboy who is modeled after Harper Lee. Her name is Ida Bell. He keeps asking, when is he going to meet his father? And he keeps rehearsing in his mind, what will he say to him? Will he go up to him and say, hi, Dad? Or, just try to act natural? Or, Father, perhaps you know me. He's never seen this man. He has no idea what to say to him. And he keeps asking, well, when is Father going to show up? When is Daddy going to show up? He practices different names. And finally, they're very elusive about it. They finally bring him in to the father's room, and he is stunned to find that the father is completely paralyzed and speechless. All he can do is move his right hand, and he has a pile of tennis balls. When he wants attention, he throws the tennis balls, rolls them across the room. So when they hear the tennis balls rolling, they know they have to go in and see what he needs. He's so taken aback by this bizarre place that he runs away with Ida Bell, but he gets pneumonia, and he has to go back to the mansion, where he's nursed back to health by Randolph the transvestite. Another thing that he's observed while he's at this mansion is that there's a queer lady, he calls her, standing at a window watching him all the time. She has fat, dribbling curls on the side of her face. When he is nursed back to health, he finally finds out that the fat lady is actually Randolph in an old Mardi Gras costume. And at the end of the book, when he goes to join her at the window, it's interpreted as a kind of acceptance of his destiny, that his destiny is to be a homosexual, and that he's going to become himself in this way with this corroded individual. Well, Other Voices, Other Rooms becomes an immediate success. And you can understand the reason, because it's 1945, and this is about the most shocking thing that people have seen or have heard in literature. And the other reason for its success is the cover. Wait, can you see that? I think that's the angle it's supposed to be. It's not a very good high-resolution picture, but you can see he's lying on a couch. This was the cover of the book, and people were completely shocked by it. It looks like it's supposed to be semi-erotic or fully erotic, or at least he looks like he's a dangerous little character. And this was enlarged, blown up, and put on in the windows of every bookshop in New York, and he began to get enormous publicity by people who had never read the book. Now, the book, I have to say, when you read it, it's the work of a very young, remember he's only 24, a very young, absolute genius. But it's a young book. It's full of bizarre people and bizarre circumstances, and everybody in it is kind of grotesque. It has that smell of a Southern Gothic novel. It's not a great book, but it's good, and once you pick it up, it's hard to put down. But it basically makes him just famous much too early, before he's really ready to handle it. I don't know that Truman Capote was ever ready to handle it. But he is famous, and so he publishes another novel, The Grass Harp, That too becomes a success. The Grass Harp is self-conscious. It has grotesque characters, although it's in many ways a sweet book. It's about an orphan boy and two old ladies who sit up in a china tree and observe life from this china tree. So he continues to be the darling of New York society. He keeps writing stories all the while for quality magazines. And he says he's collecting information to use in another book. And he collects information by going about society and going to cocktail parties and so forth. And indeed, that book comes out. In 1958, 10 years after the first one, he comes out with Breakfast at Tiffany's. Now, I don't know how many of you saw the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. A lot of you? Did anybody see it? Yeah, a lot of it, and I guess it's been on television. If you've never read the book, and if you've never read A Christmas Memory, I envy you, because it would be wonderful to encounter those books for the first time. They are both profoundly delightful. Make your way to the novel Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's very small, and even faster to A Christmas Memory if you haven't read them already. Breakfast at Tiffany's is it's just lighthearted, it's fun, and it captures New York in the late 50s like nothing else I've ever read. I had an aunt who lived in New York, and I went there all through the 50s and the 60s. I spent 6 weeks there every summer, and so it's a place very close to my heart. And this is New York the way Truman Capote saw it and the way I saw it too. Holly Golightly is a little girl from a southern town who comes there very young and acquires a very quick false sophistication. And the narrator of the book is living in her same brownstone apartment house. And he falls in love with her, more infatuation, I guess, than love at first. And he does things like he goes through her garbage and finds out, for example, that her beautiful hair color is somewhat self-induced, and finds out all kinds of things about her. She has business cards that say Holly Golightly, traveling. She doesn't have an address because she's really looking for a home. And they do all kinds of wonderful madcap young things in New York, and it's basically a love story, but with such poignance. At one point, her ex-husband, who I think she calls Daddy Jim or something like that, comes up from the South on a bus to see her, and you recognize here he is in New York, completely unsophisticated in this glamorous atmosphere, and he is the most pure and selfless and kindest old gentleman in the world. He's worth 10 of any other people on the street. And somehow Capote communicates all of that. As I say, he's just a poet of ordinary people who are extraordinary and of ordinary pain. It's a very poignant book. Well, after Breakfast at Tiffany's, he tried to write something else, a journalistic novel. That is, he tried to write about a true event and tried to write about it with the skill of a novelist. In Cold Blood is about, as you know, a rather senseless murder of a wealthy Kansas farmer and his family by two men whom Capote follows for 6 years until they're executed, becomes very emotionally attached to them, and writes the story. My problem with the story is that he never really gives you an explanation about this murder, and you long for it all the while. You wonder, well, why am I worrying about these two guys if you can't explain to me why they did this heinous crime? But it starts like this, and you recognize the Capote style even in this book. Until one morning in mid-November of 1959, few Americans, in fact, few Kansans, had ever heard of Holcomb. Like the waters of the river, like the motorists on the highway, and like the yellow trains streaking down the Santa Fe tracks, drama in the shape of exceptional happenings had never stopped there. Well, In Cold Blood instantly sold out, and it brought Capote millions of dollars. And by this time, he's really a celebrated freak. He's openly gay. He's on TV talk shows because he has such odd vocal mannerisms and because he'll just say anything. He makes up all kinds of stories when he's being interviewed. He claimed to have had affairs with people he never met, like Greta Garbo and Errol Flynn. By the way, in the story, Other Voices, Other Rooms, Joel does that. He makes up all kinds of stories. I mean, everything in Capote's work is somewhere autobiographical. He knew business tycoons and movie stars and philanthropists. He had a very long-standing rivalry with Gore Vidal to see which one of them could be most drunk, most obnoxious, and most witty. And when In Cold Blood finally came out, he gave a big party to celebrate it. It got so much publicity, it was sickening. In fact, somebody even wrote an entire book about this stupid party. Truman Capote said that people lost an IQ point for every year they spent on the West Coast. But he still nevertheless bought a home in Palm Springs as well as he had a home in Long Island. He had a long-term partner, Frank O'Shea, who objected, as one might, you would think, to his incessant drug use and his drinking. And he fought with him, and they finally separated. And then Capote really went downhill. He started going to bathhouses in New York, and he would pick up these working-class young men and then bring them to his society parties. He ran into or encountered a bank vice president, a married man with some children. And he had a long 10-year relationship with this man who was as evil in his way as Truman Capote was wrong-headed and innocent. He basically tried to embezzle Capote's literary rights, and they had this terribly destructive, jealous, manipulative relationship. He wasn't writing anything. In the 70s, he started a book called Answered Prayers. Answered Prayers comes from St. Teresa. Can't go any farther without this. It comes from St. Teresa of Avila, who said that more tears are shed over answered prayers than unanswered prayers. And he starts this novel about his high society friends. And he couldn't seem to finish it. He kept delaying the publication date and delaying the publication date, and everybody was dying to see what this was going to be about. He was going to ditch the dirt on all these people. And meanwhile, he had several breakdowns. He's in and out of rehab clinics. He finally publishes a couple of chapters of it in magazines, and all of his society friends, predictably enough, they don't like their sordid details being made public. They thought they told him these things in confidence. They don't like being satirized. They all drop him, and he really then goes to the skids. But in 1980, he has a creative burst, and he wrote, oh, I didn't show you this picture that I love. This is a picture. This is a picture of him in the 1980s, and I just love this picture. It's actually the cover of the book, Music for Chameleons. Marilyn looks just like Marilyn, and Truman looks just like Truman. She is as beautiful can be, and he is as weird looking can be. He wrote this book, and he got a facelift, and he started to lose weight, but he still could never shake his addictions. And he died in 1984 at the age of 59 of liver disease complicated by multiple drug intoxication. He died, as a matter of fact, at the home of Johnny Carson's ex-wife. And someone did an interview with him and wrote, it was just a little magazine article that I came across, but it really does sum up Truman Capote very well. This is what this newspaper writer wrote. In public, Truman Capote was outrageous. He offended and insulted people and remarked that Jack Kerouac's work isn't writing at all, it's typing. He was a social climber, a backstabber, and his behavior was frequently offensive and downright disgusting. On the surface, he did not appear to be the kind of person you would bring home to meet your family. He was also a writer of uncommon grace and sensitivity. His words whirl and twirl along the pages, spinning unforgettable images of people and places. He wrote about the frail, fragile folk who live at the margins of the world, the perplexed Holly Golightly, the confused Miss Sooke, the lonely Colin Fenwick. He reminded us always through his novels and stories that there are strange people in the world, but that they must always be treated with kindness and understanding. This is a person whom you'd be proud to invite to Sunday dinner. To learn about the public Truman Capote, you have only to turn on the television or read one of the oral histories written about him. To understand the rest, you have to read his novels and stories. When you do, you'll understand that the private man was altogether a different person. Truman Capote was one of the great writers of the 20th century. To read him is to enter a strange, magical world filled with memorable characters and fascinating places. And I suspect that after you've spent some time in his world, you'll wish you had the opportunity to bring him home to meet your family. So that's Truman Capote. And needless to say, I like his writing very, very much. Well, the next one is another poor wounded character who is Tennessee Williams. There's a sweetness in that face, isn't there? Tennessee Williams' real name was Thomas Lanier Williams. He was born in 1911 in Columbus, Mississippi. He died in 1983. And he was born in the home of his grandfather, who was an Episcopal minister. He adored this man. And by the way, the home where he was born is now the Mississippi Welcome Center, and it's the tourist office for the city of Columbus. By the way, let me stop here and ask you, is this thing at all too loud or too soft or anything? It's fine, okay. Tennessee Williams' father was a traveling shoe salesman. He was foul-mouthed, he was abusive, he particularly abused the children. He favored Tennessee Williams' younger brother, Dakin, over him. His mother, Edwina, was a Southern belle. She was somewhat smothering. He was very close to his older sister, Rose, who was a very great influence over him. She had been a very slender, great beauty, and she developed paranoid schizophrenia, and she spent her life in and out of mental hospitals. Finally, the parents agreed to have a prefrontal lobotomy performed on her, and the operation didn't go well. It left her like a vegetable, and Tennessee Williams at that point started to become an alcoholic. He never, never, ever forgave his parents for doing that. The family moved to St. Louis, and Williams started various universities, but they were poor. He didn't have the money to finish. He had to drop out, and he began to work in the shoe factory that employed his father. And needless to say, he detested it. So he began going to school at night, and he gradually worked his way through a number of universities. He went to the University of Missouri, and he graduated from Iowa, University of Iowa. He also attended the New School for Social Research in New York, always working as a busboy or a waiter or a street sweeper or something to put himself through college. And he always was writing, and he began to get some things published. In 1939, he went to New Orleans to write for the WPA, that wonderful, wonderful organization that fostered so much good writing and research in New Orleans. And he wrote his greatest plays while living here, living in the French Quarter. It was then that he changed his name to Tennessee, and it is while he's living in the French Quarter that we can lay our claim to him, because he wrote the most famous play ever written, about the French Quarter or about New Orleans. Before writing that play, he wrote The Glass Menagerie. It was his first big play and his first major success. Tennessee Williams, you know, I don't know what the secret is to making a person a success in a way that doesn't ruin him. Because what happens with Tennessee Williams is The Glass Menagerie is a hit. It's a hit on Broadway. He has several others that are wonderful hits, but never consistently. In between those hits, he has flop after flop after flop. So his writing is very uneven, and it lets him feel quite insecure. We only remember him as the great playwright. We don't remember the flops, but he certainly was always conscious of it. The Glass Menagerie is about a young man who's really a poet at heart. He works in a factory that's a warehouse that stores shoes. His name is Tom Wingfield. He even has the same first name as Tennessee. And he is talking about his life 15 years before that, before the play opens in St. Louis, which of course was Tennessee Williams' life in St. Louis. He lived with his mother, who was a faded Southern belle, just like Williams' mother, and he lived with his sister, Laura. She is crippled and very painfully shy and withdrawn, and she spends all of her time playing with a collection of glass animals, the Glass Menagerie that she has. In the first scene, Tom says, "Memory takes a lot of poetic license. It omits some scenes. Others are exaggerated according to the emotional value of the article it touches. For memory is seated predominantly in the heart." Boy, that is so true. Memory is so selective, isn't it? You remember certain things and you just forget so many other things. Amanda, the mother in the play, her husband's left them years before, but she keeps trying to get her children to live up to the social standard that she thinks they should. And she's kind of a nag. To get away from her, Tom becomes a compulsive moviegoer. And at one point, he gets in an argument with his mother, and inadvertently he smashes his sister's Glass Menagerie, her collection. Of course, as always in Williams, every important object in the play is a symbol, and this menagerie is a symbol of the make-believe and fragile world that this little girl is living in. At one point, Tom brings a friend home from work. He's a co-worker, and Laura knew him in high school, this young man, and she had a crush on him. And he comes home, and he's just enchanted with her. She's so sensitive, and she's so lovely. And when he catches himself responding to her, the friend, his name is Jim, he confesses that he's actually engaged to somebody else. Well, the mother thinks that Tom has played a practical joke on his sister, and she berates him, and they have a terrible argument. And Tom leaves forever. He's been, of course, the sole support of the family. He leaves forever, and he leaves always to be haunted by the image of his crippled sister, Laura, in the same way that Tennessee Williams was always haunted by his insane sister, Rose. He comes to New Orleans, Tennessee Williams does, and he lives on Toulouse Street, and then he moves to 632 St. Peter Street, and he writes Streetcar Named Desire. Now, for me, there are three great American plays. I hate to subject you all to this, but I just can't stand still. There are three great American plays. The first one you saw here in a beautiful performance, which was Death of a Salesman. The second is Streetcar Named Desire, and the third, if you're interested, and please don't wince, is Thornton Wilder's Our Town. Those are the three that I think are the best. He's creating very much more complicated characters in Streetcar Named Desire. They're no longer these bizarre transvestites and people like that. He creates Blanche Dubois, who is very fragile, always on the verge of, or not always, she actually is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She's had a number of breakdowns in the past. He creates Stanley Kowalski, who is not an animal the way people want to portray him. He's actually a psychologically undeveloped person who feels threatened, doesn't understand his sexual attraction to Blanche, and so projects it onto her. It's her who wants him. He's going to give her what she wants. He rapes her because he's convinced that that's what she really wants, when of course it's what's going on in his own mind. Poor Blanche utters that famous line, "I've always depended on the kindness of strangers," and of course you can't depend on the kindness of either strangers or family. And she can't be understood. But what I think affects me more than anything else in the play is that I lived in the French Quarter during those years, upstairs in an apartment with my grandmother, and Stanley Kowalski and Stella lived downstairs. Their names were not Stanley and Stella, but they lived downstairs. From time to time, Stanley would beat Stella up, and she'd come running up to my grandmother to rescue her. And then after a while, after things had calmed down, she'd go back downstairs to Stanley. Mitch, the guy who is Blanche's last hope that she thinks she might be able to marry him and get out of the situation, Mitch lived down the street. I have never, when I saw the play for the first time, I thought he had to have lived on Charter Street. He had to have lived in that very house. It was so real, the neighborhood, the characters, the idiom, the way they talked, the way they moved. And I looked it up and found out that no, indeed, he lived a few blocks up on St. Peter's Street. But I don't think anybody's ever portrayed New Orleans quite as faithfully as he did. Blanche, of course, is based on his sister, again, Rose. She's tremendously sympathetic and fragile and damaged. She's a woman who's done bad things. She got fired from her job as a school teacher in Mississippi because of her outrageous behavior, which is only hinted at, but you get the idea she was molesting little boys. She's had a number of breakdowns. She's lost the family home to debt, and yet she is totally the heroine of this play. Now, that kind of writing, that kind of manipulation of a character and an exposition of truth, that takes talent. The play was produced by Elia Kazan, who was kind of a godfather to all of Tennessee Williams's plays. About the time, I'm sorry, me and technology. I'm sorry. About this time in 1947, Williams met Frank Merlo, and he was his romantic partner until Merlo's death in '61, and he was a very steadying influence on Williams, who suffered from depression and was always scared to death that he was going to go insane like his sister. He wrote Cat on a Hot Tin Roof next, which won a Pulitzer Prize, and it created another wonderful woman character, Maggie the Cat. Maggie's married to a homosexual. She's living in a house with her in-laws, Big Daddy and Big Mama, and her brother-in-law, Brother Man, and her sister-in-law, Sister Woman, and their children, whom she calls the no-neck monsters. And she's definitely, desperately trying to keep her husband from getting himself disinherited because he's a homosexual. It's one of Williams's funniest plays. All of his plays, by the way, are funny underneath. And it has all these wonderful lines, like when Big Daddy comes in and says, "There is the odor of mendacity in this house." You never forget it once you hear it. And his last great play was Night of the Iguana. He was very distressed by the unevenness of his plays. Do you know he wrote 87 plays, 3 novels, a bunch of screenplays, poems. Even Truman Capote wrote quite a bit. We only remember their best stuff, thank goodness, huh? Um, he had, as I told you, so many flops on Broadway and so many successes, and he's always using the themes of homosexuality or lobotomy, as in Suddenly Last Summer, or macabre deaths, or all three. And almost always he describes a slightly unstable but resilient woman. In This Property is Condemned, for example, that's one of the most poignant little monologues. There's a young girl who's homeless and she's living in an old condemned house, and throughout the monologue she's dressed in this tawdry old evening dress like little girls use for dress up. And she's very witty, and she talks about her teachers in school and all that. And she's not aware, but you're aware as a spectator, and it breaks your heart that she's losing her grip on reality. It's an enormously poignant little play. Well, I don't want to talk myself out of time. When Merlot, Williams's partner, died from lung cancer, Williams went into a terrible depression that lasted 10 years. He began being violently jealous of younger playwrights. And in 1969, he went to a detoxification clinic because he was addicted to alcohol, amphetamines, and barbiturates. But in the 1980s, he was amazingly accepted in the Soviet Union, the biggest success since Chekhov, and they particularly liked Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and The Rose Tattoo. One of the lines from The Rose Tattoo is, "Time rushes toward us with its hospital tray of infinitely carried narcotics. Even while it's preparing for us its inevitably fatal operation." Tennessee Williams died in 1983 in a hotel room after a night of drinking. He must have been trying to get into a barbiturate. He took a bottle and tried to open it. When he couldn't open it, he tried to open it with his teeth, and the bottle cap went down his throat and strangled him. So it was a very tragic death. Of course, I don't know what deaths are not tragic, really. We're all doomed to a tragic death. Now, the last person I want to talk to you about, and I just have a few minutes. I don't know, can I go a little over, or is that forbidden? I can't? Oh, good. The last person I want to talk to you about, you probably have never heard of. She is unknown today. She's not even really a writer. She called herself a good newspaper woman. She was more famous than all these guys put together in her day. She was probably the most famous American of her time. And she lived and worked her whole career right here in New Orleans. Her given name was Elizabeth Meriwether Gilmer. She was born in 1861 in Tennessee. She died in 1951 here in New Orleans. She was called the best loved woman in the world. She wrote under the name of Dorothy Dix. And I remember as a little girl reading her columns in the Times-Picayune newspaper. She was one of the first advice columnists, and she was more famous than Ann Landers or Abigail Van Buren or any of them. And she was also more fun, I think. She was so well known, they said the world brought her its secrets. She was syndicated all over the world, and people who looked like her would go into Italy and Australia, these were documented happenings, and ran up bills because the shopkeepers thought it was Dorothy Dix and they wanted to give her everything, especially credit, but they piled all kinds of gifts on her, and actually these were false Dorothys. She received 2,000 letters a week. People had no idea she was writing from New Orleans. They thought she was writing from their hometown, and a lot of times they'd say, "Meet me at John's drugstore at 4 o'clock and tell me, because I can't wait for your answer in the paper tomorrow. I need your advice." She shouldn't be, oh, let me take Tennessee off here and put Dorothy on. Poor girl, she wasn't pretty. Very often she's confused with Dorothea Dix, the reformer, but she's not the same. Her wisdom consisted in challenging the conventional wisdom. For starters, she thought that the family was an overrated institution. She thought gossip was a real good thing because it kept people straight. She said without gossip, we'd all do anything we wanted to, whereas it's the fear of what other people are going to say about her, about us, that keeps us on the straight and narrow. And all her life, if there's one theme that goes through her columns, and I wrote a chapter of a book, I contributed a chapter of a book about her, and so I had to do a lot of reading about her. And I read just decades worth of her columns, and if there's one thing that comes through in all of them, it's that she tried to dispel women's fantasies of the ideal marriage. Her childhood was spent as a tomboy. Her mother died when she was young. Her stepmother insisted that she had to go to church, but she didn't insist that she go to school, so she was pretty much uneducated, except that there was this kind of shabby old man who lived on the place or came on the place, and he was amazingly well read. And he took an interest in this little girl, and he started tutoring her, and he gave her Dickens to read and Shakespeare and all kinds of great works for about 2 or 3 years. But that 2 or 3 years was enough that she became really very well educated, probably better than she would have been if she had gone to school. She married her stepmother's brother, who was 10 years older than she was. He was very, very handsome, very ambitious, very given to tall tales and fabrications. And when she got married, it became apparent pretty early that he was unstable. But it was she who had the nervous breakdown after living with him, not he. At 32, she was staring at the ceiling, her lips mumbling, and nobody could talk to her. They thought that she had completely gone insane. So her father scraped up the money to send her to the Gulf Coast for a rest, and it so happened that when she was walking on the beach, she met a woman who lived next door to her little cottage. That woman was Eliza Poitevin Nicholson. That woman owned the Times-Picayune newspaper. And she bought a story from Elizabeth Gilmer for $3 and gave her a job on the newspaper. Her job was reporting obituaries that had not been reported. So she went around the city scraping up all the dead people she could scrape up. People said that rather than let her quota fall, she would kill somebody in order to report it. And then they moved her up and gave her recipes, and she loved recipes and loved to learn cooking. Then they gave her theater, and she loved reporting on theater. She walked into that Times-Picayune building, and it was like an overcrowded oven. There were reporters there who were sweating, and they were cursing, and they were reading these long proofs and smearing them with their sweat and then swearing. Everybody was talking to himself as he worked. Everybody was ignoring her. It was a big bustle. And she fell in love with newspaper work. She never wanted to do anything else. And after working so diligently at these things, Mrs. Nichols finally gave her her own column, Dorothy Dix Talks to Women. And then they shortened it to Dorothy Dix Talks. And this was the time when women were being fed all this claptrap that, the perfect wife was always submissive and she always just wanted to get married. And I don't know, it was a lot of propaganda. And Mrs. Nichols wanted her to write a column that would talk to women frankly. And she did. She was very frank. She said relatives, if they can't get along, ought to stay away from each other. There are plenty of agreeable strangers in the world. Practically the only people who ever say wounding things to us are those in our own household. And she told young people to save up for their old age. She said, you'll learn, if you don't, how steep are the stairs of another man's house. Which, she had these platitudes that were just perfect, and they were so wise. And naturally, she started writing a lot about marriage, how to get into it and how to endure it. She said that the foolproof way of getting a man was flattery. and to flatter him about things that he really isn't so good at. He'd really rather hear that. A famous surgeon would much rather be praised for his atrocious poetry than his skill at the operating table. When they moved to a question and answer format, one of the questions would be something like, should you marry somebody whom you would love even though he may not love you that much, or should you marry somebody who adores you but you're kind of lukewarm about? And she said, in every couple, one kisses and the other submits to being kissed. And she advised this woman and all the people who wrote like this to marry somebody they loved. They would feel jealous from time to time, but there was a little bit of ginger in that. And she says, you know, if you marry somebody that you're not very much in love with, marriage lasts a long time, and it's longer if you're bored. She wasn't as sassy as Ann Landers. She was much more maternal, but she got off some really good witticisms. A young man wrote to her that he had taken his girl to dinner and then took her to the theater and then dancing. Should he have expected a kiss from her when he took her up to the door and said goodnight? No, I think you did enough for her. She said a few words of love were more important to a woman than having a man work his fingers to the bone for her. To men, love talk was a kind of courtship propaganda that they undertook so they could get married and never have to resort to it again. The man who told you he would make your life a dream of bliss has forgotten he ever said it, and he expects you to, too. Her own husband was a very difficult person. He set up a turpentine factory in New Orleans, and just as he was enjoying a little bit of success, he had very little success in his life. Her column was beginning to be regionally syndicated, and she got an irresistible offer from William Randolph Hearst in New York to write for the New York Journal. Her husband refused to go with her for a number of years, but eventually he followed her, and whenever she had parties at her apartment in New York, O. Henry, for example, was one of her good friends. He sat in the corner glowering and very resentful and just totally jealous of her. Now, the whole time, I'm going to describe her work in New York, but keep in mind that the whole time she kept her columns 3 times a week coming out of New Orleans, and that these were syndicated worldwide. One assignment for the Journal in New York was that she had to follow Carrie Nation around Kansas for a week and report on her. Carrie Nation was the one who was breaking up all the saloons with hatchets. You know, this was the temperance movement. And Dix went to interview Carrie, and she found that she was very maternal and unpretentious and a sane-looking woman. And she only made strikes against saloons, she called them joints, if she heard voices. What voices? Voices from God. They tell me which joints to break up. And she wrote, Dorothy Dix wrote very sympathetically about this woman who, when her husband left her with a little baby, she prayed to God to send her a new husband. And Dorothy Dix kind of captured that on the one hand, and she captured this wacky atmosphere of these temperance gatherings. She said there was this midnight meeting in which each of Carrie's followers brought a new, rather business-looking hatchet with them. And the meeting would start with Carrie kneeling on the floor and droning prayers for an hour. And she went on and on and on and on. And finally, about 3 a.m., she gets up and she says, God doesn't want any joints smashed this night. And these women were so put out. They had hired babysitters and this and that and sneaked away from their husbands, and they had these hatchets. And there was a riot, and they started threatening to chop Carrie Nation to death. So it was really funny. Then William Randolph Hearst assigned her crimes, and he gave her the most grisly, notorious crimes to report on. Somehow, Dorothy Dix was able to get these people, these heinous criminals, to sit down and talk to her. She interviewed the school teacher who beat, starved, bludgeoned, and poisoned her 3-year-old stepdaughter. She attended the murder trial of a white slaver who lured his victims by offering a stenography course in the newspaper, and a 15-year-old girl who was trying to remember that this was when times were very, very hard. This 15-year-old girl was trying to support her mother, and she went to his apartment to apply for this job, and portions of her hair and scalp were found in his fireplace. She was sent to interview a bigamist, and she said he was a shabby little rat of a man who looked like he'd been left out in the rain all night. And she says, "You married 36 women? How?" And he said, "Oh, Miss Dix, it was the easiest thing in the world. I just talked to them about themselves." She had a lot of insights. It was suggested at one trial that a man hadn't been killed by his girlfriend, that he had actually committed suicide. And she wrote, "Men have died and worms have eaten them, but not for love. When a man commits suicide, it's about money." Will it be all right if I go for about another 10 minutes? Okay. It won't be any longer than that, I don't think. And the most famous trial she covered was that it really wasn't any crime at all. A judge dropped dead at his desk. And it was found when people rushed in to rescue him that he had a little screen, probably not as sturdy as that screen there, and it only went up so high. He had a screen in his office, and behind that screen, his mistress had been living for 4 years. He had a wife and children, but he would find one excuse or another to spend most of his nights in his office working. And this woman had special felt slippers so that she could walk around and not make any noise. And she stayed there. People would come in his office and do office business and so forth, and they never had any idea that she was there. And Dorothy Dix asked her, well, she had never been outside in all that 4 years. And she said, "How could you do that?" And she said, "Well, I loved him." And she said, well, this woman, by the way, had been put in jail to keep the reporters away from her because she didn't want to talk to him, and they were just pounding the jailhouse down. But she agreed to talk to Dorothy Dix because she said that she and her lover, who had been a judge, used to read her column together to each other. So she was glad to talk to Dorothy Dix. By the 1920s, that sociological study, Middletown, that was made of Indiana, reported that Dorothy Dix was everywhere. Even the optometrist used her column for his eye test to see if people could read it. She got marriage proposals every week. Her face was on the sides of buses. All this time, she remained rather oddly married. George continued to resent her. He suffered terribly from arthritis. He would sit in his parked car brooding for hours. He'd stay away from home for days. Finally, he was wheelchair bound, but he kept wanting to get up and walk, even though she tried to get him not to. One day, he did succeed in walking. He walked out of the apartment, and he never came back. He went to Florida and talked about hating her, and she never wanted to divorce him. She said, wisely, I think, in the final analysis, we all depend for happiness on the people we love. It's some peculiarity of women that makes us go on loving what has become unlovable. She dispensed advice about marriage for another 22 years. A woman was complaining, for example, about her husband smoking. And she says she was going a long way out of her way to find something wrong with a man. She ought to be thankful that she didn't have some real trouble like drinking or gambling or stinginess or another woman. Stinginess was the worst thing a man could have. Remember, this is the time when women were pretty much dependent on men, and it was the Depression years. And so if a man was stingy, a woman had a hard time being happy. Lots of complaints came to her about unfaithful husbands. She said when men reached the age of indiscretion, they had a sudden yearning for romance and flirtation, the last call to the dining car. And she urged wives just to sit still and wait. She hardly ever advised divorce unless people were really fighting, because she said in that situation, the kids would come out of the marriage as shell-shocked as if they'd been in a war. She never advised psychotherapy. People couldn't even afford to put food on the table. They weren't going to be able to afford psychiatry. Dorothy Dix's problem was that she was not succinct. She could never just get off a good line and let it go at that. She had to keep yammering on for 3 or 4 paragraphs until you wanted to strangle her. And a lot of times she was very sentimental. She wrote something that I think was a very nice column, but you kind of hate yourself for liking it because there are just puddles of sentimentality all over it. It's called The Ordinary Woman, and it has a lot of solid ideas. She said, many mothers go years without a single night of unbroken sleep. They brave death without a second thought, caring for contagious little ones. The ordinary woman makes huge sacrifices to educate her children, knowing all the while that in lifting them out of her sphere, she's widening a permanent chasm between them and her. For one day, they'll be ashamed of her. At the same time that she's sentimental, she is the least romantic and most practical of commentators. The average girl is simply slopping over with romance, she says. Without a doubt, marriage is a cruel disappointment to 9/10 of those who enter into the holy estate. The alert, smiling people who are gaily chatting at restaurants are unwed, or they're talking to other people's husbands and wives. She said that the deadly rival every man was sure to encounter in marriage was not tall and dark, but small and pink. The first baby definitely and for all time puts the husband's nose out of joint. She didn't have any use for women's rights. She liked men. She saw no reason to disabuse them of the notion that they were smarter than women. If you will notice, it's only women who prate about equality between the sexes. Men take no stock in such heresy. When a man tells a woman that he looks up to her and worships her, he doesn't mean a word of it. The very basic thing on which a man's love for a woman is based is his sense of superiority to her. He wants to feel stronger than she is, wiser than she is, be more successful than she is. That's, of course, why intelligent men marry morons and are happy and contented with them. If women would only abandon their theories about what matrimony should be and how husbands should act and deal with them as they are, it would save a flood of tears. Men feel like fools when they are exuding love talk. And as soon as they get the ordeal over with, as soon as possible. A man considers that by marrying, he has given proof of his devotion, and there's no use saying anything more about it. The idea that his wife might cease to love him never crosses the average man's mind. Well, she lived out her long life in New Orleans with her brother, who lived in an apartment downstairs from her, so close that we can hear each other change our minds. A man came up to her one time back when she was looking at some things in a show window, and he said, "Oh, little lady, I'll buy you anything you see in there." And she turned around and recognized the guy. It was a coworker. And she said, "Oh, it's you. I thought I'd been insulted at last." She hated music and corsages. She said about music, "I'm like the man who knew only 2 tunes. One was God Save the Queen, and the other wasn't." She died in 1951 at the age of 90. She was in the hospital, and a nurse came in and brought some flowers, and she said in this syrupy, patronizing voice, "Look what we have here, a bunch of pretty flowers." And she answered, "Oh, I thought it was a bunch of Presbyterians." Her most popular column, which was repeated over and over again, was 10 rules for happiness. I'm going to read you her 10 rules, and that will close our discussion of writers of Louisiana. Rule number 1, make up your mind to be happy. Nail on your face a smile that won't come off, and after a bit you'll find that it comes there naturally. If we're ever to be happy, we must be happy now at the present moment. We can't put it off till tomorrow. 2, make the best of your lot. Of course you're not everything you want, and things are not quite right. There isn't a single human being who doesn't have plenty to cry over. 3, don't take yourself too seriously. Don't think that everything that happens to you is of world-shaking importance. 4, don't take other people too seriously. They're not so much anyway. You can't please everybody. Please yourself. 5, don't borrow trouble. All of us have lain awake at night dreading some calamity. Generally, it never happens. 6, don't cherish enmities and grudges. Meeting someone you don't speak to will spoil any party. Forgive him, not for his sake, but simply because it's making you unhappy to be stirred up all the time against him. 7, have as many interests as possible. That's the way to keep yourself thinking that this is the best of all possible worlds. 8, don't spend your life brooding over mistakes you've made. Don't be one of those who never gets over things. 9, do something for somebody less fortunate than yourself. 10, keep busy. You never saw a very busy person who was unhappy. You're a great audience. Thank you so much.